The nature of a conversation around mental health tends to lean towards the negatives that people experience when living with a disorder. But are there positives that we could look at, and even positive traits of a mental health disorder that we could leverage to our advantage? Here to answer those questions and more is triple board certified forensic and neuropsychologist, Dr. Judy Ho. Dr. Judy, what do you think about this, taking a positive spin towards a mental health disorder?
I love it, Kyle, because I think it's so important for us to not only focus on all of the difficulties, but also to focus on some of the things that could be positives. We talk about strength-based work or positive psychology, and I think that this is one of the best applications of it, especially because I know that individuals who suffer mental illnesses, they have self-stigma, they have other stigma, they have people judging them for whatever condition that they've been diagnosed with, and they probably judge themselves. And that is a negative cycle that it tends to create because you're trying to get better, but you have all this hopelessness around the fact that you have this condition in the first place and all the negative connotations around it. So let's get into some of the positives. Let's talk about how we can make some of these traits work for people.
First of all, why does BPD get such a negative rap?
BPD gets such a bad rep. I remember when I was in training in my doctoral program and people were swearing up and down that they were not going to ever treat somebody who has borderline personality disorder. And I think if there's any clinicians watching, you're thinking, yeah, well, good luck with that, because it is one of the more common personality disorders. And it's inherent in so many other conditions that you might see somebody for, like depression, anxiety conditions, and PTSD. And I think we oftentimes focus on the negatives because people are thinking of how to treat the problem. So we're identifying the problems.
Yep.
But also, I think BPD individuals get a bad rep because they're known or they're thought to be very dramatic, or they have these wild swings in their mood. And people just hear that. And I think that makes them have a negative connotation towards individuals who have this condition. But I also want to point out that personality traits are on a spectrum. I have many patients who have some traits of BPD, but they don't meet the full criteria. And we talk about those traits insofar as if it's impacting their functioning or their relationships negatively. And sometimes it doesn't, because they're not necessarily under a ton of stress at a different time in life. And then some of those traits don't end up rearing the more negative aspects of themselves. I want to focus today on talking about the positive associations with some of these traits that when the person is under stress can certainly have negative consequences. But what about when the person is feeling pretty good, or when they're not necessarily under a ton of stress, or maybe they're in treatment, so they're really cautious and aware of how these traits can go down a negative path, and they're really cognizant to not let it do that. Then I think some of these traits actually have their upside. So I'm excited that we're doing this episode.
Yeah, well, let's start with one of the traits that we would be considered more positive.
Well, one would be increased empathy. Individuals with BPD tend to be more hypersensitive to their surroundings and to what other people are thinking about them. In a darker time, that might lead them to act out in ways that are very disturbing to the relationship and the longevity of the relationship itself. But it also gives them this sense of understanding what someone might be going through, maybe even before the person knows it themselves. So I've certainly had individuals who were diagnosed with borderline personality disorder that just seem to be a little bit more attuned with what other people might be feeling. Sometimes their guesses may not be right, but they're more likely sometimes to ask another person about how they're feeling, or be more aware that the person might be upset, whether or not they actually are. And that can actually be a very helpful trait. And for a person who is a loved one of that individual, you can see how they might feel very special because this person is constantly attending to how you're feeling and making sure that you're okay.
It's peculiar, to talk about positive traits in mental health disorders, because no question, we really focus on the symptomology that makes them a disorder, and they are largely negative things that most people struggle with incorporating into their lives. The only other condition that I think we've done this with is with ADHD, where you can be hyper focused on something that's very productive, and some people would look at that as a positive benefit of that. I was just thinking, I have depression. Before this discussion, I probably wouldn't have thought about the good parts of my depression. But even very quickly, when I ask myself that question, I think, well, because I'm depressed, it has, in a way, forced me to be very in tune with my emotions, starting at the age of 9, to really get clear on how depression comes up. And
Hmm.
conversely, when I'm feeling good and not depressed, being aware of those emotions. And so it's forced me in a way to be very mindful of how I am feeling, which is a very great gift. And so I like that we're having these discussions that are positive around these mental health disorders, because it gives people a more holistic look, I think, at how they can manifest. Do you have any thoughts on that before we go to our next trait?
Well, yeah, I'm so glad that you're thinking about how it applies to yourself and your experience, and that there are these positives despite all the darker times and the more difficult times, that
Mm,
there's the positives that should be acknowledged, and people should feel good about. And so
yeah.
I think sometimes we over pathologize, sometimes in a way that is trying to be helpful because we're trying to treat the problem, but it's also nice to recognize the other side of it. So again, I'm glad that you like this discussion. You see its applicability to yourself.
Yeah, it does feel different though, being in this seat and going, all right, now what's another great trait about
Yeah.
BPD,
Yeah.
But let's move on to another trait that could be more positive in certain light rather than aversive.
Okay, well, another one that's really important and might make you a best friend to a lot of people is flexibility. So,
Mm,
individuals with borderline personality disorder sometimes experience a lot of identity shifts. They don't necessarily know all the time who they are or what they might like individually or what they want to do. And sometimes you'll see that they jump from job to job or hobby to hobby because they're not quite sure what's going to fit. So obviously that can be very frustrating if that's taken to the extreme. But if it's only a mild presentation of that, you can see how that person is just more flexible. No matter what somebody else says, they're saying, yeah, sure, I'm game to try that, even though I haven't done that activity before. I'm okay to try it. That sounds okay
mhm.
to me. Or if somebody says, hey, what about for this weekend? We do this instead of the usual thing. They're not as rigid as certain other people. For example, individuals who have obsessive compulsive personality traits, they tend to be a little bit more rigid. They probably want their schedule the way they want it, and they're not as flexible. We can also talk about the positives associated with OCPD, and I think we should, because obviously OCPD individuals tend to be more perfectionists, so they tend to produce work of high quality. That's another conversation. But one of the things that I think BPD individuals have that most people with OCPD might struggle with is this level of flexibility in terms of, you know what,
Mm,
I don't really mind because I'm not exactly sure what I want anyway. And it's okay for me to go along with the crowd. And I don't actually feel like I'm suffering or giving something up that's really important to me. So it might not be very distressing for them either to go along with whatever other people are doing that day and just be willing to try new things.
yeah, well explained, Dr. Judy. Are there any other traits you can think of that would be more positive?
Yeah, so another really positive trait of individuals with BPD is that they tend to be bolder in terms of their decision making. Now,
Mm,
obviously, that impulsive dimension of BPD can be disastrous at times. We sometimes associate, for example, with alcohol and drug abuse, right? But we're talking about the positive side of that boldness. That positive side of that impulsivity is that they sometimes risk take in good situations that actually lead to great outcomes. I've had individuals who have borderline personality disorder tell me that in their best of times, they've made really excellent business decisions where speed was important and they didn't have a ton of time to just mull things over. And so they just decided to take a risk, and that risk paid off and it helped their business. So
yeah.
you can see that that can be a positive aspect of that impulsive dimension of BPD.
Yeah, you're really opening my eyes to this. And I can imagine the person who might be going to therapy and learning about their impulsivity, or that they're extremely empathic, and hear all these things and go, man, uh, that all sucks. And I
Yeah.
wish I didn't have those things. But with this simple reframe, there are positives behind that behavior, that it could be really appealing for somebody to re understand. So thank you, Dr. Judy, for this. I hope we can do more videos that point this out, because, like you mentioned, pathologizing things just to pathologize them, that's not the point here. We want
Right.
to be very clear. Everything is on a spectrum. These diagnoses are designed to inform treatment, and so let's do it in the most accurate way possible and not in a stigmatizing way.
I'm so glad that you said that because I oftentimes think about the fact that we frame personality disorders as sort of lifelong struggles. It's really about managing those traits rather than those traits completely go away. And
Mhm.
so I just want to give some hope to individuals who have BPD out there and say, hey, you know what? Some of these traits have positive dimensions to them. So why don't we try to really focus on that? And that can be part of your treatment, is to try to bring out the positives associated with some of these traits that are thought to be lifelong and are thought to be difficult, especially in stressful times. Let's talk about ways in which we can make it a better thing.
Whew, well said. We have some fabulous series on the topic of borderline personality disorder, and also the typically #1 referred treatment, which is dialectical behavior therapy. You can access those at medcircle.com using the links below this video. Dr. Judy, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Hit the thumbs up button if you don't mind. It'll help spread this credentialed mental health information to others who need it. I'm Kyle Kittleson. Remember, whatever you're going through, you got this.